So I know it's a bit long, but would you mind reading one of these quarantine poems? I'm thinking specifically of my personal favorite, which is the April 8th poem.
That's interesting that that's a favorite of yours. In a way, it's a favorite of mine, um, uh, too, but for the most eccentric reason possible, which is um, I was reading either Therese or Milosz, both of whom are mentioned here. I don't remember which,
Right.
and and I suddenly had the idea for this poem, and I jotted it down on the bookmark, and then that bookmark has somehow sort of circulated through different books over the last several months. So every month or so, I open a book and I see this bookmark that has the first all but illegible sketch uh, of this poem, it's there's such a pleasure in the mystery of going from zero to one, from nothing to something, and that bookmark reminds me of that kind of feeling of blessing, um, when you get to make some new thing
Nice.
every time I see it. I'm grateful for you asking me to read this one for another reason, and that it's a poem in part about the absence of baseball, and I just realized in 4 days the first spring training games are going to be played this year, so I'll be glad to have baseball back in my life after
Nice.
its several months absence for the off season, but also after the terrible truncation of the season that occurred last year. So April 8th, 2020. The vodka bottle, blue as buried sapphire, has lain near empty on its side, a year or more, forgotten at the freezer's back, beneath the bags of strawberries, fries, and nuggets, and thickening with a glaze of permafrost. The state stores being closed, and suddenly without means of buying more, I dig it out. This is no era for martinis, all briny and medicinal, but sweetness, compensatory, generous, and concealing. And so I watch it flow like syrup down into the crevices of ice, then top the highball off with juice. This hour of night in normal times, I'd take my drink and sit, a book in hand, to catch the baseball game. I'd alternate between the back and forth of lines of verse that volley down the page and glances up to see the Cubbies' struggles. There on the screen, encircled by the crowd, who turn their backs upon the world and yet provide a noisy solitude, the pitcher shakes off a signal, nods, winds up, and throws. At such remove does art find concentration. The thing made stiffens toward integrity, 9 doubtful innings, fumble to a hole, and thus take on a kind of permanence. The season, like the liquor stores, suspended, I feel myself fall back on younger ways. I'd sit up reading till the early morning, a sleepless, lonesome undergraduate, and switch, as hours passed and I grew weary, from book to book, with each one lighter, easier in sequence, till my eyes at last dropped shut. As I did then, I find myself once more. Alone, a crop of titles at my side, I open up Milosz. It's like a phone book and not more interesting at first, it seems. The listing hazy images of dreams mistaken by their source for prophecy. But when the Nazi tanks roll into Warsaw, the spine at once grows straight. The ruined street and what lies buried in its sudden wreckage become too serious and lost for playing. A pile of books stacked in a roofless building, the lambent face of Giordano Bruno surrounded by the busy market stalls, the chatter as the tourists spoon gelato, the poet staring on his father reading on broken statues, churches, emptied ghettos. His voice cries out in heavy lamentation to see the art that he had meant for freedom. A flight of butterflies, a taste of vodka burning then disappearing on the tongue, must come to something far more serious. His natural love would have preferred affairs with all the European capitals, to savor brilliance without consequence, and traipse from place to place and settle nowhere. But now he's rudely forced to take dictation, to make a record of what's been destroyed, preserving too in ink the names of those who laughed, so pleased to be the ones destroyed. He's had to root his love and hatred down in one foundation, lest it be forgotten. Resigned himself to play the mournful witness who digs in deeper as he heads to exile. The minutes creeping on toward somnolence, I pull out my collected Betjeman. His boisterous, thumping ballads make me think of Kipling or what Eliot said of him. It may not come to poetry, but verse contains its own perfections, and, he adds, perhaps a little envious, it's verse that people memorize and sing and say. They'll clap to lines of Exeter and Croydon, while sighing above their pints, and with a curse summon the friendly bombs to fall on Slough, to which there's no replying but with cheers. It's such an easy accidental contrast, the serious poet, witness, visionary, as formless as a ghost weighed with lead, in confrontation first with Nazi troops and later with a whole regime of lies, as Russians came to be a second master. And Betjeman, who failed at math, but could stomp out a rhythm with his drunken hoof to set the patrons rocking on their stools and let them know their island's not so bad. But I'm not done. I find upon my stack the story of a soul, and there she is, Therese, that round face floating in her habit, who tells us not all flowers can be roses, that we must take such grace as we are given. I'm not the first to see her infant freedom, that liveliness which tumbles into trouble and teeters high upon a kitchen chair, that flighty glee to play at kings and queens, will carry her just where she's meant to go. All freedom seeks its fullness in a cloister. All laughter merges with the prayers of Carmel. In solitude we find our company and speak most frankly in a form commanded. So much we can discern within that portrait of her dressed up to play St. Joan of Arc, that wild mane parted, draped behind her armor. One hand upholds the flag of fleur-de-lis, the other lightly rests upon a sword. How freely she would give herself away, to burn within the fire of Christ's love. O Lady of Lisieux, I think you found the form where depths reveal their splendid glory. You are the living image of perfection. But then, the mind adrift, the hour late, I think as well how perfect form appears within the pitcher working from the stretch. His spine upright, his rear foot on the rubber, his eyes indifferent to the facing batter and conscious of the runner just behind him. He holds his glove raised up to hide his face, and in the leather darkness of its womb, mysterious and patient, he will form an arc of flight to catch the outside corner, chosen for just this moment and that man, but also in response to what has come before and what will follow down the count. Each pitch contains, within its narrow compass, the splendid, sprawling thoughts of past and future, and yet remains a thing of concentration, whose name proclaims itself in what it does.
The way that the poem kind of finds the balance between, I don't know, like pure play and like depth and solemnity in Saint Therese, and I guess kind of then takes it back and brings that back to the experience of a game of baseball, is really interesting. There's something in Sanctity that manages to sort of like transcend those human types.
It's so strange with Milosz. You could to read his first poems and then to read some of his more mature poems reflecting on the kind of career he thought he was going to have. That I describe it pretty accurately in the poem. He really had this vision of being a sort of aesthete whose poetry would work like a taste of vodka. It would just burn and then leave nothing behind it. And that was not where his talent lay at all. And and it's so hard to really get your mind around this, to contemplate this. He had a talent that was perfectly attuned to bear witness to the great crimes against humanity in the 20th century, first by the Nazis and then by the Soviets, uh, and to stand athwart that, to record it, and to insist upon man's spiritual destiny despite these materialist philosophies that were trampling everything underfoot. So, what you see in his work is someone whose talent was perfectly calibrated for a task that, had he just been born at another time, would have been an irrelevant task or not the task assigned him. And he would have
Yeah.
done something else altogether. And this poem as a whole um, is, and indeed the Quarantine Notebooks as a whole, are kind of explorations over how all these things that seem so highly contingent and improbable, that not that it's that bizarre that I would just happen to have Milosz and John Betjeman and Therese stacked on my uh, on my side table, and that I just happen to be reading them at the same time, and they just happen to form a perfect philosophical dialectic about the nature of art. Um, that's not the most improbable of things, but there are so many incredibly improbable things that look like pure happenstance, pure circumstance. And then we look at them closely and we find that in God's providence, they are rhyming together. They are forming resonant sounds that build upon each other and build up to some large, magnificent structure. Um, Milosz is just one example in the poem, but a great example of how curious history works that way.